Thank you, Anusha. It's really a pleasure being here. This has been a great conference. I have only one complaint. The previous presenters have set the bar too high. So I will try to not fall too far below the cutoff, though. This project is joint work with Surendra Bagda. Surendra has his doctoral degree from Carnegie Mellon, and we began, along with Lowell, working when Surendra was at Carnegie Mellon. Surendra is a member of the Indian Administrative Service. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it is an extraordinarily competitive position to our group to join, with incredibly difficult exams and interviews and so forth. And an advantage from our perspective is that, as well as Surendra's, is that it's a position that commands great respect in India. So when he asks for data from various entities, they're always happy to oblige. And so he has the kind of data access that one can only dream about. My other co-author is Lowell Taylor. Lowell is the Heinz University professor at the Heinz College at Carnegie Mellon, so I have really accomplished co-authors. In terms of backdrop to this paper, there was, I can't think of a reason to invoke Socrates, but I thought I could do Adam Smith. So economists, of course, think that competition is valuable in many situations, and back circa 1962 or 63, Milton Friedman began the advocacy in the US of educational vouchers to infuse private competition, and one of his arguments was that it would cause public schools to up their game. I recently co-authored a review with Richard Romano and Miguel Urquiola on vouchers in the US. It turns out the impacts are, generally speaking, not nearly as large as economists might have hoped. But one of the findings that is relatively robust is that in places where there are vouchers, if a voucher school locates near a public school, that public school actually improves in terms of the performance of its students. So we are investigating a similar issue, except in India. It's not a voucher program, but it's the impact on performance of public schools when a private school enters in a village. It was mentioned earlier, but absenteeism of teachers in the developing world is a serious problem in India, particularly severe. Visits to a representative sample of schools in India found on average 25% of teachers were absent, and only 45% of teachers were actually teaching in the public schools in India. So a very serious problem. What is kind of astonishing and makes one wonder about the effectiveness of competition with private schools is that 23% of private school teachers were absent, and 48% of them were teaching at the time of these visits. So neither sector seems to have a very high commitment on the part of teachers. Nonetheless, our interest is in investigating the impact of private school entry and whether their presence and their attraction of students might in turn result in the public schools improving. So we're actually going to investigate the effect of private schools on educational outcomes of public schools, and we're also interested in the effect on which students are attracted. So there's kind of two issues. There's the issue of what is called cream skimming. Are the private schools attracting the wealthier and more able students? And then the impact on the students who remain in the public schools. This is a graph from the World Bank showing the increase worldwide in private school enrollment. So you may not be able to read the percentages, but in 1998, 19% of students attended a private school, and that has gone up to 26% as of the most recent report in 2016. In the US, of course, it's been essentially flat for a very long time, around 10 to 12%, so we don't have that phenomenon. It's even more pronounced in India. India in the year 2000, 42% of students in high schools were going to private schools. That increased to 50% as of roughly 2016. So half of high school students in India are going to private schools. If you look in the large cities, the percentage in private schools is as high as 80%. What we're going to do is study the entry of private schools in villages and use that design. It's part of our design to investigate the impact of that private school entry. So we're going to document, and we do document, stratification across the public and private schools by caste and by income, and also by gender, and then the impact of private school entry. So in the state that we study in India, all of the students, in order to graduate, have to pass a graduation exam. And we have the exam scores for all students in the state who took the exam for the years 2004 through 2009. In those years, they actually issued numerical scores. Unfortunately, in 2010, they switched to a system of ABCD. So they made the reporting much coarser, and the availability of the underlying scores is unfortunately just, they don't retain those, they just keep the ABCD. So we aren't able to use the scores. What we do have is pass-fail information for the 2010 and 2011 that we plan to use, but not in this analysis yet. This exam is a very tough exam. In our sample of 2.9 million students, about a fourth of the students flunked the exam. So what we have in our data for each of these students, we know the gender, the caste, whether the student attended a private or a public high school, the year they completed school, that is the year they took the exam, what their score was, whether they passed or failed, and we also know where they went to school, the village in which they attended school. Now this is cohort information, so we observe the outcomes for the students at the end of their high school. We don't observe multiple outcomes for a given student. We observe outcomes for each of a series of cohorts. In one year, 2007, we also see an income indicator, a poverty indicator for whether household income was above or below 12K rupees. So entry is defined in our analysis as the first cohort that graduates. So of course the actual entry happened earlier, but just for nomenclature we'll call the first year of graduation, just for convenience, as the entry date. We have a balanced panel of villages. We call treatment villages the villages that had a private school enter in 2007. So we have then 3 cohorts of graduates before the private school entered, and 3 cohorts of graduates after the private school entered. The non-treatment villages had no private school throughout. So basically our idea is a very simple event study idea, which is we're going to compare the outcomes in the 3 years after private school entry to the outcomes 3 years before private school entry. And we'll use the non-treatment villages to give us kind of a baseline against which we compare. So we have 240 treatment villages, 3,222 non-treatment villages. Again, roughly 2.9, almost 3 million students in total. Of those numbers, 2.7 million were in non-treatment villages, 222,000 were in treatment villages, and 27,000 of those went to private schools. We are particularly interested in investigating the impact on students in the treatment villages who remained in public schools, and so roughly 200,000 such students. We're not uninterested in the students who went to private schools, but as I'll explain, we're not very well able to pin down the impact on the private school students. So the way that we proceed is that we include village fixed effects, so an indicator variable for every village, year fixed effects, and then we include 6 indicator variables, one for each of the 6 years, that is the pre and the post entry. So the indicator, wanting to get the pointer here, the indicator variable for a given year is 1 for students who took the graduation exam in a treatment village in that year, and 0 for students who took the exam that year in a non-treatment village. And again, 2006 is the year before entry. We have village fixed effects, so we can normalize then at 0 the average score in each village in the year before entry. So we can then compare the changes in scores before and after against that 0 benchmark for the pre-entry year. We're interested in cream skimming, so we're interested in the selection across public and private schools by caste and gender and income. And so I have a brief overview of theoretical model and some results on sorting, and then I will talk about the findings with respect to achievement. So the theoretical model is actually a relatively straightforward framework. We have students who vary in household income and in ability. And here ability is really a shorthand for high school readiness. So it's any experience the student has had up to that point, or heredity, environment, etc., anything that affects the readiness is what we're calling ability of the student. We don't directly observe ability, we observe achievement of it. It's a useful construct to think about in the background. And then a distribution of ability in the population of students, a joint distribution of ability and income. And then the expected ability of a student conditional on income is increasing in income in the model. The idea is just simply that students from high-income families are going to have had more opportunities to prepare. And then the achievement of the student depends on the quality of the school and the ability of the student. This is based on work that Rich Romano and I did some years ago in terms of the theoretical framing. And then we think of the student and the household of the student as a decision-making unit, and the household is trading off consumption of goods versus expenditure on tuition. So on the one hand is sort of a consumption, which is the household income net of whatever they pay tuition. And then the other thing that households care about is the achievement of their student. And so utility then, income net of tuition and achievement. Public schools are free, private schools charge tuition. So that's the basic setup in the model. And then the assumption that we have here is that the higher income households are willing to pay more at the margin for an increase in school quality than lower income households. I think that's an uncontroversial basic assumption. And high ability households are willing to pay at least as much for an increment in quality as low ability households. And these two very, I think, minimal assumptions. These two assumptions deliver predictions about cream skimming. This is just saying in symbols what we've said in words. So the implications that come from this model are private schools must be superior to public schools in the eyes of the parents, otherwise they wouldn't pay tuition to send their kids to private schools. For a given ability, so comparing students of a given ability, there will be stratification by income. The highest income households of a given ability will exit to private schools, and the lower income households with a given ability, their students will remain in public schools. And again, this just reflects this notion that high income types are willing to pay more at the margin for an increment in school quality. And then because income and school readiness are positively correlated, another implication then is that the average ability of students in private school will be greater than that in public schools. And moreover, what we're saying here is the private schools are drawing the wealthiest and the most able students out of the public school sector. So we would expect the average school readiness of students in the public schools to go down. So this is just a picture that illustrates this idea. We have school quality on the horizontal axis, a public and a private school. And on the vertical axis, the public school is free, the private school charges tuition P, and then the blue is a high-income household. All households like high quality and low price. The high-income households are willing to pay more for quality than the low-income households, so they go to the private school with a positive tuition, and the lower income household opts for the public school with zero tuition and lower quality. And that's kind of driving these results that I talked about earlier. So if you think about the space of ability and income, then if we look up along the income dimension, the wealthier households are going to send their kids to private schools, the poorer households to public schools. The horizontal axis here is ability. If high ability types are also willing to pay more for quality, then what you'll see is that still be the poorer students in public schools, but we'll also see that the boundary is going to be downward sloping as ability goes up. And then a picture in terms of differences across castes. So what I've talked about so far is kind of stratification by ability. You could think of that as within a given caste. The lower castes are poorer than the upper castes. So another implication is that the fraction of upper caste students who go to private school is going to be greater than the fraction of lower caste students who go to a private school. And this is just two income distributions. The blue one is the lower caste, the red one is the upper caste. Again, those above a certain income level are going to go to private school. That cutoff is the same across castes, but there are more of the upper income than the lower income castes with income above that cutoff. So the upshot then, within each caste, the mean income of public school students will fall when a private school enters. These are predictions. The fraction of upper caste students attending private school is greater, so the cream skimming effect is going to be greater among the upper caste students. Also, we observed this income cutoff into income poverty indicator in 2007. Another prediction that comes from the model is students who were in poverty, that is below the cutoff. It will still be the case that the upper castes will exit to private schools more with higher frequency than the lower caste. And this is simply because even if they're both below the poverty line, the upper caste student is likely to be closer to the poverty line than the lower castes below it. And then similarly for students above the poverty line, again, we would expect a higher proportion of upper caste students. Okay, so let me just turn to the data from here on and show you what the findings are. So this just shows you the comparison of the enrollment by caste in the non-treatment villages and in the treatment villages, and you particularly be interested in looking at columns 2 and 4. And what this shows us is that the composition by caste is roughly the same. So in terms of and I've ordered the castes from lowest to highest in all of my tables. So the lowest group, the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes, were actually viewed as so low that they were not even counted as part of the caste system. And so particularly disadvantaged groups, and historically, as you probably know, castes determined what occupation you could be in, and it also carried for lower castes many other restrictions on social interaction, education, and so forth. Those were all outlawed in the Indian Constitution in 1947. But of course, as we all know, those kinds of differences in poverty and background persist over generations. So basically, when we look down the column here, the most disadvantaged are the scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and then the other backward castes, referred to as OBCs, vary in disadvantage, and the order again is the order of disadvantage, not the order of the alphabet. And then the open caste is the highest caste group. And then there are a relatively small proportion of others that vary by religious affiliation and so forth. Okay, so looking then at we'll do the cream skimming predictions first, and then turn to the achievement. And so what you see here, so this is looking at the stratification across the public and private sector. So, and this side of the picture is students who were below the poverty line. And what you can see, as we predicted, is that the fraction of students going to private schools ascends as we move up the caste hierarchy. Among those who are below the poverty line, the SCSTs only 1%, and then the upper caste, the highest castes, 8%. We also had predicted that we would see a similar ascending pattern for those above the poverty line. This is the one prediction that is not supported by the data. The fraction of the households who send their kids to private school among those above the poverty line is essentially invariant to caste. So that's an interesting finding that warrants a bit more investigation. Unfortunately, we only see this poverty indicator. We don't see the income distribution. So an interesting puzzle that we're going to have to try to find more information about is whether the distribution of income for those above the poverty line is similar across castes, and whether that will be feasible to get or not. But in any event, we see the evidence of the stratification by caste over here. And notice that by far the largest proportion of students are below the poverty line. Okay, and then if we this is the data. I should have reversed the order of these slides. This is the data for all students, regardless of income. And this is organized by gender. And what you see here, the percent in private school among women does indeed go up as one moves up the caste hierarchy. And we see the same thing for men. So movement up the caste hierarchy, that is the cream skimming evidence. If our model is silent about gender as a role in private school attendance, But if you look across the rows, what you see is in the lowest caste, there's really no difference between men and women, but the proportion of men in private schools is substantially higher in the upper caste than it is in the lower caste. So that's another kind of, it's an interesting observation, and understanding why is something that kind of remains on our agenda. So another implication is that within each caste, the mean ability of students who remain in the public school will fall when a private school enters. We look here. So if the public school, so yeah, let me just, I was about to jump to a different point. So within each caste, the prediction is that the most able students leave, and we've seen that the higher caste students, the higher income students leave in higher proportions, and when we would expect them to have the highest school readiness. So if the public schools don't increase their gain, then we would expect that the average performance in the public schools would go down after a private school enters. And that, if there are peer effects based on ability, the peer effect would actually accelerate that fall in achievement. And so the upshot here is, and this is really a crucial point, is that unless public school effectiveness increases when a private school enters, mean achievement will fall in the public schools when a private school enters. And first of all, this, in terms of discussing ability, this slide is to show you that there really is selection on ability, and then I'll turn to the slide that looks at the effect on the students who remain in public schools. So what you can, so this, and the table, all the tables I'm going to look at are organized like this going forward, so it's a good opportunity to kind of review. So we have 6 rows, and these 6 rows are the 6 cohorts. And so the IM1 means this is the year before, the cohort before private school entry in a village, 2 years before, 3 years before, and then 1, 2, 3 is the following the private school entry. And then this shows you the averages. But what I want to emphasize in this slide, and then go into more detail in the public schools, is if you look at this size, so these were students in these villages previously in public schools, so that's why we have dashes here, is that this is the average for the schools they were in. Then you look here, and by the way, all of these measures now are in standard deviations, and a 0.05 standard deviation is a big effect in most educational interventions in the US. Sarah showed us one earlier where it was dramatically bigger, but as she said, that was just off the charts effect. So what we see here is that in the private schools, there's 0.85 standard deviation higher than in the public schools they attended before. This can't possibly be a treatment effect. Got to be a selection effect. We just don't see anything like that in education. So this is evidence that there is selection by ability, and reinforces the idea that the lower ability students are the ones who are remaining in the public schools. So the reason we're focusing on public schools and performance is the following. We know the school that a student attends, but not where the student lives. And students who go to private school might choose to travel from a nearby village. And so that kind of makes analysis of the effect of the private school on the students who attend even more difficult than it would be. It would be hard in any case because of selection effects. So we But the other implication is that if we look at the overall average achievement in a village after private school entry, that would not be a good measure because it would combine the sort of mobility effect of the students who might be traveling to go to the private school. So we focus on the public school students. And here, as I noted before, the prediction is that the average is going to fall after private school entry unless the public schools get better. And I think I've said all of that already. So again, bottom line, we expect average public school achievement to fall when a private school enters because more able students switch to private schools unless the public schools up their game in response to the competition from private schools. Okay, so then what I'm going to show you now is the average scores of the lowest caste, the SC/ST students, and then what happens before and after. So and we're doing it by gender so this is women students and men students. And what you can see is in the period before private school entry, the average score on the graduation exam across these three cohorts has dropped. And it's dropped by a lot. Between the 3 years before entry and 1 year before entry, the average has dropped by 0.058. This is no private schools present, so they haven't affected it. And notice it's very similar for men and women. And so the upshot is that the academic performance is declining in the treatment villages before the private school enters. Kind of makes sense that the private school might be picking out the villages where the public schools are really performing poorly. And then what you see after the private school entry, so again, what one would expect with the more able students being pulled out is you would expect this trend of decline would become more severe, but it doesn't happen. So the scores of the students, especially the women students, do not continue to decline. They actually rise a bit, not significantly, but the scores go up by about, the amount that they increase is about 0.03 standard deviation, but roughly equal to the standard error. But the key thing here is that the scores have gone flat instead of continuing to decline. Same story for both the male and the female students. And so the upshot is, despite the adverse selection, despite the loss of the more able students from the public schools, the scores don't fall. And so the implication is that the public schools have upped their game to the degree that they have offset the effect of the loss of the upper ability students, so the average in the public school has actually not been lowered. This is a picture of what was on the previous slide. So the blue here is showing the score, the average for the, this one is for women's students in the lowest caste, going down before private school entry, and then when the private school enters, the public school average actually improves. This drop before private school entry is significant at the 10% level, not at the 5% level. But again, it's a big drop in a period of 2 years before the private schools come in. So that's for women in the lowest caste. This is for men in the lowest caste. The pictures are almost identical. And now what I have here is then the same, except it's all of the students combined, regardless of caste. Same story here. The scores are trending downward before entry. When we put all of the castes together, the drop is not as big as it was for the lowest caste. So the other thing this tells us is the lowest caste students were suffering the biggest declines in scores before the private schools entered. The average across all castes was going down, but the effect was not as big, and it was happening for both genders. After private school entry, no more decline. What we see is actually a slight improvement, but again, with the adverse selection, we would have expected an accelerated decline rather than going flat. Okay. And then the final thing that we did is to investigate the intensity of competition. So what we would like to have is a measure of the quality of the private schools, but we don't have that. But what we can observe is the fraction of the public school students who exited to private school when the private school entered. And so basically, if you think about the 6 years on the horizontal axis, I should have put it on a slide, so I'm going to draw in the air instead here. So you think about the 3 years before entry, there's total enrollment in the village. Everybody's going to the public school. Private school enters, there's a drop, and then whatever was the kind of trend, whether there was growth or not. So what we decided to do is to run a simple regression where we put in the dependent variables, the log of public school attendance, a constant term, a time trend, and then an indicator for private school entry. And the coefficient of that indicator for private school entry is an estimate of the percent drop in enrollment in the public schools when the private school entered. So we did that for every treatment village. And then what we did is we organized them by saying the 120 treatment villages with the biggest reduction in public school enrollment experienced high intensity private competition. Private schools are sucking out a lot of students. And in the other 120 villages, we classified them as having low intensity. I should emphasize that this is preliminary, not because we did anything wrong, but because we think there's probably a better way to do this than we've thought of so far. But the results are really quite striking. We've implemented this only for the lowest castes so far, and again, preliminary. But what you see here is that the high intensity, which I've put here in red, so this is before private schools, so the intensity doesn't come up before. The private school isn't even there. So we see this pattern we've noticed before, decline in, and again, this is the two lowest, the SCSTs, both men and women. And this is the decline that we saw before, 0.056 standard deviation decline over the two cohorts before the private school entered. In the years after entry, where the intensity of private competition was low, essentially nothing. There's zero. So even here, it didn't continue that downward trend in scores. It leveled off. But what we see in the high intensity competition is that the treatment effect of the entry of the private school is on the, again, we're looking at the averages in the public schools, in the treatment villages. The gain was 0.072 standard deviations. At the second cohort, 0.06, third cohort, 0.07. So basically, what we find is that the high intensity competition from the private schools seems to have caused the, and I use the word cause here carefully in that we are thinking about this event study, the private school entry, as having this causal impact on the performance in the public schools. So, so to summarize then, what we've found, and we view this as preliminary, significant stratification by caste, so cream skimming by caste across public and private schools, cream skimming by income, but public school scores don't go down. Now, this is still not necessarily, this is good news in saying the those who remain in public schools are not adversely affected. They're probably actually helped by the competition. But if the private schools are really better, which we don't know, but if they are, as the model would say, why would anybody go and pay tuition if they're not better? So the expectation would be that the inequality in educational outcomes might go up, even despite the fact that the public schools are doing better. And then competition seems to matter. So that's the end of the story.
Thanks.
Can I ask quick?
Sure.
What do you? Maybe I missed it. Do you know what happens to the resources available to the public schools?
Oh, that's a very good question. We don't know that. So, and something I should have mentioned. So one thing that might be happening is because there are, if the teachers have life tenure, so the odds are pretty good that the at least the teaching resources in the public schools are not being reduced. And so it may very well be that what we're seeing is that the students who remain getting more attention, which is a good thing, given the absenteeism issues and so forth. But I think that was implicit in your comment, and you're absolutely right, yes.
So a quick question about, so in the health sector in India, there have been some documentation that some of the doctors have their private clinics on top of being doctors in these healthcare centers that are run by the public. So I was wondering if there's a parallel thing. So in the education market, there is true that a lot of teachers who teach in public schools do take sort of tutoring in the evening, moonlighting as a tutor in the evening, where they don't really teach the students in the classroom, but they would spend more effort in teaching them when students actually come to their.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if the presence of more schools and more private teachers who teach in private schools would sort of increase the extent of this tutoring market.
It could be.
So
yes.
that's why the scores of the public schools are not going down.
Yeah, that's a plausible hypothesis. We do know that at least for students doing college prep, that tutoring is widespread, but we don't have any measure of that. So you might very well be right.
But it's interesting to sort of contrast it to whether it's the competitive pressure or whether it's something going on in the sort of the informal market.
Yeah, that's a good point. What we're seeing is good news in the sense that the average is leveled off instead of accelerating down, but where it's inferential that it's competition and not, or resources or tutoring.
Yeah, just a question about the decision for private schools, the type of information they have about the villages. I mean, presumably they don't have information about the student scores in those villages. That's data you have, but the type of decisions they're making to choose one village over another?
Yes, I think that's a really good issue, and an issue that I think would be of interest for us to try to model the entry decision. As you saw in the data here, the fraction of these villages that had private school entry is relatively small, so there's a bit of an issue with doing a kind of logic thing, but we can probably make some headway on that. And Paul Peterson had suggested that we might want to do some sort of matching to try to find the closest similar villages without entry. So I think that's a really interesting issue. We also do have the data for the cities. We're not, so it'd be also interesting there to sort of look over time at what neighborhoods since we do know where they are. So I think there's a lot of potential to look at the entry issue. Yes.
And I don't know much about sort of related studies, but how do these Indian results compare to findings in other countries?
So if you have insomnia, there's a paper review paper that we did not, don't really mean that. I have outstanding co-authors on that paper. So there's a Journal of Economic Literature paper that we just published last year reviewing all of the evidence on voucher schools and so forth. What we found, what is true in the U.S. is if a voucher school, so Milwaukee has the biggest voucher program in the U.S. It's been around since circa 1990. And what has been found there is that if a voucher school locates near a public school, it improves, and the estimates of the effect size is like 0.02 standard deviation. So significant, not earth-shattering, but non-trivial. And Mackie Raymond has done something similar in Washington for charter schools. It turns out that a typical charter school near a public school has no effect, but what she finds is that a high-performing charter school next to a public school causes the traditional public school to up its game. So there is some evidence that the private competition induced by vouchers in the U.S. is having an effect. In Chile, Miguel Urquiola, who was a co-author on this, has studied extensively, and there's big cream skimming effects, but the evidence for treatment effects in terms of educational outcomes is pretty disappointing. So a lot of variability, and yeah, we try to summarize. There's a surprising number of these programs in the U.S. and around the world, but we try to summarize it all there. Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Joe Munich from Generation Next. Two questions, just following up on the resources question. I'm not familiar with the funding policies in India, but do the resources follow individual students, or to the extent that if a student leaves the public system, does that reduce the resources going to the public system?
I don't think it does in the short run, and an issue that we want to investigate is whether there is teacher reassignment at some point. My expectation is that probably as long as the public school doesn't close, that the teachers stay in place, and that not much happens probably for years until they reach retirement would be my conjecture, but I don't know.
So to clarify, it's not per pupil funding then the way that it is here?
I don't think so. I don't
Okay.
think so. Yeah.
Because that's one of the risks here with lower enrollment in public schools, is that then the resources also reduce.
Yes.
Proportionally.
I'm not sure whether we will. We don't have the data for. We'd have to hire somebody to visit every school, and then whether they could go back that far. Hiring somebody in India to do that is actually not overwhelmingly costly, but whether the records would exist going back to these cohorts would then be a bit of an issue. But we haven't decided on that. Yeah.
I mean, it's just a question of policy, I guess.
Yeah, I see.
You just don't.
Yeah,
just
well,
don't know
policy
how it's
I
funded.
can find for sure.
Like here, you get funding based per pupil.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
pretty straightforward. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a question that Surendra would, if he
Okay.
were here, can answer.
Okay.
So I'll ask him, and
All right.
I'll know the answer.
Yeah, because that might be significant in terms of if the resources are held constant, then you wouldn't necessarily expect to see a decrease. Like you said, there might be more resources going to fewer students, which is actually a positive
that
effect.
could be. What's about.
My other question was about the comparison villages. You mentioned that sometimes students travel to other private schools. I was wondering how you considered that. Did you draw some kind of a perimeter around a village and look for private schools that were open nearby?
So we have not done that. What we know is if the private school is in the village, if the students travel to go to the private school, that doesn't affect what we did here at all. Public school students, we don't think it's an issue of them traveling. That's why we originally were going to focus on the village average, and then we discovered that some of the private students might be coming from adjacent villages, and so we switched our focus to the public schools, and this is immune to that issue then of whether some of these students in the private schools are commuting or whether they all live in the village doesn't affect what we're doing. So that's why we went with the public school focus here.